0451 is a number you see tossed around as a reference in a lot of games. It's shown up in everything from Bioshock to Deus Ex to Firewatch and more. And if you have ever noticed these numbers as a recurring trend, you might be wondering why this particular string of digits became so popular with game developers. Well, to understand 0451, you sort of have to understand Looking Glass Studios. In the 90s, they developed a number of memorable games, including the popular flight simulator Flight Unlimited, but arguably their biggest contribution to games was being among the first studios to really probe what Warren Spector has dubbed immersive sims, starting with Ultima Underworld, the Stygian Abyss in 1992. Mark Brown's already done a fantastic video over on Game Maker's Toolkit breaking down this genre, so if you want a more thorough look at the concept, I'd recommend checking that out. Suffice it to say, this then nascent genre became something of a house style for Looking Glass, taking cues from first-person shooters and RPGs in equal measure to produce something that felt fresh and original. These games had stories and writing, but weren't driven by stats and dice rolls the way other RPGs were. They also had shooting and a first-person perspective that emphasized a sense of being there, but didn't focus purely on combat the way other first-person games of the time did. It was a marriage of the storytelling and player sheet building sensibilities of an RPG with the immediacy and spatial nature of FPS games. The numbers 451 first entered the picture with what could be considered Looking Glass's third immersive sim released in 1994, System Shock. 451 was the code used on the very first door you encounter in the game, and was a reference to Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. Eventually, the number became something of a statement of identity for the company. The number was referenced again in System Shock 2 in 1999.
I'll set the new code to 45100. That should be easy enough to remember.
And I would argue the number gets obliquely referenced in Thief 2 through a 457 in an early level that looks a lot like 451 due to font selection, but maybe it's just me. Look, Thief kind of gets grandfathered in here because it's a Looking Glass game and embodies the same ideas even if it doesn't contain the literal reference, but moving on. And then there's future Deus Ex and Dishonored developer Harvey Smith's story about interviewing for a job at Looking Glass and being taken out to lunch.
There's a door to their offices, Looking Glass Technologies. There's a key code on it. And we're about to walk in, they're leading me in, and so he stopped everybody. He was like, wait. He's like, Harvey, what's the code? And I just looked at the keypad.
Does anybody know? Can anybody answer that question? Oh, God.
I just looked at the keypad, and I just went 0451, and the door opened. And Art patted me on the back, and he was like, good.
The point is, the numbers may have started as a cute literary reference, but became something a bit more, a sort of recurring self-reference that helped define the company's sense of identity. And it's interesting to speculate from the outside as to why those specific digits became emblematic of Looking Glass Studios. Unfortunately, while that speculation is fun, the reality of why it took hold is, I suspect, a lot more banal. It's a reference to a book that then got referenced as a key code to the office door that then got re-referenced in System Shock 2, and at a certain point the original context and meaning of the reference is lost, and all that remained was its internal use. By all accounts, it didn't set out to be a company-defining statement, it just sort of happened that way. Unfortunately, Looking Glass Studios closed down in early 2000, and with it went the company that made 0451 a marker of its identity. But in the years that followed, we saw something of a redemption arc for 0451, as developers, often including key Looking Glass alumni, would try to pick up the design ethos of the now-defunct studio and carry on in its name, and use those numbers as a callback. In this context, 0451 became not a marker of a single company, but a declaration of the sort of experience the game you were about to play was going to provide. It was a statement of both design lineage and design intent, but also a bit more. Obviously, there was the commitment to levels being problems to solve using tools rather than content to churn through mechanically. Just to fit into the genre of immersive sims, most of these games needed to pull from that design methodology. But there are also thematic threads through a lot of these games, starting with System Shock 2, that are surprisingly consistent. First, there's the idea that they all take place in a fantastical setting gone bad and twisted. These games tend to be set in far-flung imaginary places, but almost always after some sort of fall or collapse. System Shock 2 is set in the world's first faster-than-light spaceship, but after it has fallen to the many. Bioshock is set in the underwater city of Rapture, after genetic splicing has driven everyone mad and it's every man for themselves. Bioshock Infinite is in a city in the clouds, during racism and revolt and revolution. Prey is set in a retrofuturist alternate history space station where Typhon mimic monsters have escaped and killed most of the crew. Dishonored is in a fantastical Victorian steampunk city after a plague has decimated it. Even Deus Ex is set in a cyberpunk future ravaged by the Grey Death and income inequality. These settings ground the proceedings in genre tropes, which provide a layer of pulpy sensibility to the text. And the after the fall bit ensures that designers can emphasize that players can solve problems however they want, with minimal concern for traditional social norms. Heck, it's not an 0451 game, but even Zelda kind of borrows this idea for its immersive sim-influenced iteration. The world of Breath of the Wild is already after Ganon has all but won. It's a good approach to set up pulpy tropes as allegory for some deeper thematic thread, which we'll see in a second, and to facilitate player choice without worrying about real-world consequence, though obviously this has some downsides too. I.e., murdering everyone is a valid option, and often enough celebrated, and that's not normally a good thing. But put a pin in that idea, I think we'll come back to that in the coming weeks. Another recurring thematic motif seems to be the person of power who sees all and is usually responsible for the fall. Shodan in System Shock 2, the Outsider in Dishonored, Andrew Ryan, Sophia Lamb, and Comstock in their respective Bioshocks, your brother Alex in Prey, Bob Page in Deus Ex, the Trickster Gods and Hammerites in Thief. They represent the power structures that have failed and caused the chaos you're fighting against, almost always as a manifestation of a social norm or extreme ideology. And here's where the 0451 formula starts to really be set apart as its own thing rather than just games in the immersive sims genre. They don't just take place in a fantastical setting after the fall, but a fantastical setting after a fall caused by an ideology driven by a figurehead. That ideology is ostensibly what the game wants you to look at and what drives most of the narrative. Whether they succeed, we'll get to that, but that's the idea. The player, in turn, stands as a sort of moderating force against those extremes. In System Shock 2, there's the solipsistic individualism of Shodan, embodied by cold machinery.
Remember that it is my will that guided you here. It is my will that gave you your cybernetic implants. The only beauty in that meat you call a body. If you value that meat, you will do as I tell you.
And then there's the collective hive mind of the entirely organic The Many.
Do you not trust the feelings of the flesh? Our biology yearns to join with yours.
The player, as a cybernetically enhanced individual, is both of machine and of organic matter, both of society and an individual. They exist in between these two realms and act as a moderating force, keeping the two extremes in check. The same thing with Thief, which I've gone over before. The chaos of the trickster framed by nature and the near-fascist order of the Hammerites framed by religion, government, and machinery. Garrett represents the balance of both. He needs the order of society to exist in order to make stealing things like money make sense and be worth it, but as a thief he represents a violation of that order. So it's no surprise when the two extremes, both absolute chaos and absolute order, are both pushed back into balance by the character who represents the duality of them. Bioshock sees the player first fight against the libertarian ideals of Andrew Ryan in Bioshock 1, and then the extremist collectivism of Sophia Lamb in Bioshock 2. Bioshock Infinite regrettably has you fight first against the racists, and then shock and awe, the people fighting the racists are just as bad. And look, Bioshock Infinite remains trash thematically, but it does fit this overall trend of the player trying to moderate two extremes, even if it's grotesque.
They're just right for each other, aren't they?
Who?
Fitzroy and Comstock.
Dishonored asks that you choose between indulging your powers but promoting chaos at the behest of the Outsider, and a chaste but boring playthrough that reinforces the anti-magic position of the Overseers. Prey frames you as torn between empathetic selflessness for the stories of others and rigid self-interest and mechanical efficiency of completing your objectives. Deus Ex frames you as torn between not two but three competing ideologies at the end of the game. The recurring idea is you get this conflict between two or more extreme ideologies that the player has to wrangle back towards the center or has to choose to resolve the conflict of in one way or the other. And this works in some games and it doesn't work in others. Bioshock Infinite, again, being a pretty great example of how wrong the whole "the truth is in the center" thing can get. But Deus Ex, which we'll be looking at in detail soon, tries to play each philosophy off of one another to get at your core beliefs. How do you think power should be structured? How does government work? Thief uses it to highlight the necessity of two extremes being in harmony more than the extremes being evil in and of themselves. On the other hand, System Shock 2 definitely points to the two extremes as being equally dangerous. Really, 0451 games on the whole tend to be about how we think about ideologies more than the ideologies themselves. Bioshock, for example, isn't a nuanced critique of Randian objectivism so much as it is a look at taking an unstable worldview to its most extreme logical conclusion, and its sequel only pushes this further by doing the same to extremist collectivism that has no regard for the individual. None of these games are really interested in the ideas themselves so much as the concept of moderation and extremes and how they interplay with one another. And again, not all these games succeed at what they try to do thematically, but these heady ideas about ideas cast against pulpy, tropey settings is really what helps define 0451 games for me. Also, this isn't really a structural or thematic point, but it's just something I noted. There's usually a twist at some point that recontextualizes your relationships with the characters in the game world.
That's right. I'm working for the NSF. I'll meet you at the 747.
Would you kindly? Powerful phrase. Familiar phrase.
The Polito form is dead, insect. Are you afraid? What is it you fear?
The end of your trivial existence.
He's Zachary Comstock. He's Booker DeWitt.
I'm both.
Oh, and these games used the crap out of scrawled graffiti on the walls. Like, they're not the only games that did that, but these games make a point of emphasizing environmental design so much that the messages in blood and other liquids sloppily pasted onto walls run from System Shock 1 all the way up through Dishonored. Anyway, the point is that despite having disparate developers over about a decade apart and being set in vastly different settings, these games all had a similar structure. Not just mechanically, although as immersive sims that's generally true, but in terms of thematics and narrative structure. And in this sense, these games marked with 0451 have made 0451 stop being a marker of Looking Glass itself and started being a signifier of the sorts of mechanics and tropes that would be invoked. It was a promise to players about the sort of experience they were about to have. And now in the 2010s, the code has become even more abstract, a signifier of developer lineage rather than a marker of a single studio or a declaration of design intent. Recently, developers have started taking what they've learned from their time spent on various 0451 immersive sim games and applying it to their own ventures. You see this with Fulbright's Gone Home, where environmental design techniques used in Bioshock 2 and Minerva's Den become the basis for the entire game. You see the player forced to find a middle ground between conflicting desires in games like Kent Hudson's The Novelist, in which the player is a spirit that helps a family choose between their individual passions and commitments to one another. You see Thief's core play mechanics merged with Deus Ex's cyberpunk aesthetic in Neon Struct. And you see it in games like Campo Santo's Firewatch, with Ned as the all-seeing mastermind that causes the conflict. I don't think these allusions to the 0451 immersive sim games themes are necessarily intentional, but it's sort of interesting to see the developers of these games carry the echoes of their previous work and then reference it directly. In this context, I would argue, 0451 gets brought out as a badge of having trained under a specific school of thought, like a martial artist who learned a specific style or a chef who studied particular techniques at a particular school. You can generally tell this application of 0451 because the numbers are more hidden, later in the game, or optional, where modern immersive sim 0451 games throw that badge up early and proudly. Also, their developers tend to have credits on previous 0451 immersive sims, so yeah. What started as a company's defining in-joke, like Maxis's Llamas or Apogee's Dopefish, became a statement of a game's design ethos and a promise to players about the experience they were about to have, and then finally became a badge of honor or statement of pedigree. So what does 0451 mean? It means a lot of things in a lot of different contexts. It depends on the game, who made it, when it was made, and more. It's a literary reference, a statement about a given game's goals and structure, and a statement about a game's developer's influences. Above all, though, it speaks to the legacy of one little studio in Massachusetts. And that is a nice story about how these magical numbers became more than just a reference, and eventually how one small studio's influence spread to AAA and indie alike. The Looking Glass magic is alive inside all of us is a nice sentiment. But after writing this script, it feels too pat. One of the things that's gnawed away at me while writing this piece is how presumptive it all is. After all, there are games that reference 0451 with no direct relationship to Looking Glass, either because of coincidence or as a reference to Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451 unrelated to Looking Glass's works, or just because they thought it was a cool thing other game developers were doing. Then there are games like Arx Fatalis that try to continue in the Looking Glass school of design without a direct 0451 reference to be found, so it's not like it's a real meaningful marker of where this game design philosophy is showing up. And tracing design lineage is kind of a thorny question that borders on auteur worship. The people who decide whether to put 0451 early in their games tend to be creative and design leads, so we're not really tracing design philosophy spreading around the globe so much as career paths of individuals, and that's a little weird. Also, while the player is mitigating force between two extremes theme is definitely in there in Looking Glass style immersive sims, I'm not necessarily sure we gain anything by seeing that. In retrospect, it mostly feels like a collection of games that paint their villains and their entire ideology as an extreme evil to justify the fact that you can solve problems however you want, up to and including mass murder, which is why all you ever see are extremist ideologies and not nuanced discussions. Then, after you've done one extreme in one game, you mix it up in the sequel by doing the other extreme, and hey, suddenly the player is a moderating force. I don't know, I'm worried a lot of this amounts to Tommy Westphal universe-style pattern matching. You know, I saw the same cigarette brand in 2 different TV shows, so clearly they're in the same universe, and the themes run deep, man! And it's not that that's not fun to see the patterns that connect things, but I'm also not sure it gives us an appreciable insight into these works. Here are some general patterns that most, but not all, of these vaguely related games kind of have, is a little too flimsy for my tastes. I think this video does a good job explaining the trail of 0451 games through the years and how that idea has evolved, but I think it does a really bad job of breaking them down thematically. A lot of this is a stretch, and I'm aware of that. But I did promise 0451 coverage that I am happy with, and so how about this? I'm declaring this the summer of 0451, and I'm going to look at a few games of that Looking Glass lineage that I've been meaning to get around to, but haven't. Some of them are going to be recent, some of them are going to be a bit older, and maybe we'll find some more interesting and more concrete things by looking at these games individually, rather than trying to make grandiose statements about all of their interconnectivity thematically. And we'll be starting with Deus Ex very, very soon. I've already got about 4 pages of notes, I just need to turn that into a real script and slap some video on it. So yeah, this will be fun. Let the summer of 0451 commence.
We've had to endure much, you and I, but soon there will be order again. A new age. Aquinas spoke of the mythical city on the hill. Soon that city will be a reality, and we will be crowned its kings. Not better than kings. Gods.
I feel like there's an entire online angry debate session that you could have about whether Thief counts as an 0451 game or not. It never evokes 0451 directly, but also it's actually made by Looking Glass, which I think gives it a bit more of an oomph in that category. Oh, also, don't forget to join Discord, especially if you're a patron. We got a secret chatty channel, so you can hear me complain about writing scripts and also see pictures of dogs and stuff. Yay. Alright, back to working on Deus Ex.